back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and this is our weekly hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to people of African descent and others fighting to build a better society. Every week we've had some powerful conversations. We've had roundtables, we've had authors, we've had topical subjects that have really pushed us. Today is a day that would not have been possible prior to COVID because there was no Black Table show. But we've been waiting on this monograph that we're going to talk about today, this book, and this author who has a long stretch of work as a master teacher, master administrator, educator extraordinaire for quite some time. We are joined today by Dean Emeritus of the Howard University School of Education, Dr. Leslie Fenwick, Dean Emerita, rather. Let me get my grammar correct. She's professor of ed policy at Howard University, of course, holds an appointment as Dean in Residence of the American Association for Colleges for Teacher Education. She is a former visiting fellow and visiting scholar at Harvard University. She has worked at every level and in every valence and sector of American education. She was a preschool to K-12 teacher. She's an administrator in public schools, urban and private universities. She's been a faculty member at HBCUs and HWCUs, that will be historically white colleges and universities, worked as a foundation officer, program officer, nonprofit board service. She was also a legislative aide in the legislature of the Ohio Senate, and also a finalist for the United States Secretary of Education in the Biden administration. There are any number of other accolades, and I may mention some of them as I go on. One of the most satisfying ones for me is every time I go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I see Dean Fenwick's name because she was on the scholarly committee put together by the great John Hope Franklin himself to design the content for that museum. So we are thrilled to be joined today to discuss her book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, The Untold Story of Black Principal and Teacher Leadership. We're joined today by Dean Leslie Fenwick. How are you, Dean? Welcome.
I'm doing well, Dr. Carr. Thank you. Thank you not only for inviting me, but for doing this show. It's a very important show. As I mentioned to you, colleagues from other universities and across the country have been calling me, quoting you to me. So I'm glad I'm finally before you. Thank you. Well,
we're together. And it's so wonderful, Dean, because as we know, even though we both are have been associated for a long time with Howard University, as I told the students in Morehouse one time, there's only one big HBCU with a lot of different locations. I said, I know y'all don't believe that, but I think about the fact that we recruited you, of course, from the Atlanta University Center, and we go all the way back to Ohio State and graduate school where you represented there. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. In fact, let's start there. Jim Crow's Pink Slip. You opened this book so powerfully with an encounter that you had while in graduate school. Could you talk a little bit about what you experienced there and how that led you to this important topic? In fact, I would argue, and I would agree, in fact, with Richard Milner, of course, who was the series editor with the Race and Education series at Harvard Education Press, when he says this is perhaps the most important topic we can have in education. But it started in grad school. Is this what happened?
It started in grad school. This book, as you well know, is a long time coming. I was taking a politics of education course when I was a PhD student. I guess part of this message is to our graduate students, particularly our doctoral students, to listen to your own mind and to value your life experiences and have that inform your scholarship. So I was taking a politics of education course as a PhD student, and the faculty member teaching the course decided that we would not begin the course with conversation about Brown, but rather the 1971 decision, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg decision. And I was really looking forward to this course because I believed, even as a doctoral student, that the politics of education was the Brown decision. It is the Brown decision. And I was looking forward to our discussing that. So I was disappointed that we were starting at some other point, which seemed kind of irrelevant. Additionally, the faculty member began the class at that time, back in the old days, with a transparency that listed all of these negative statistics about Blacks in education. There was no framing of these statistics. There was no discussion about how these statistics are a symptom rather than a cause. There was no analysis that would lead the class to understand that the statistics that were being shared not only were some erroneous, they really reinforce racist assumptions about Black people, our intellectual capacity, and Black students' ability to achieve academically. And this bothered me. So I said, I'm going to march over to the library and bring back some information and statistics to share with this faculty member so that he would, in the hope that he would reframe the class and also return us to a discussion of Brown. And that experience really deeply affected my orientation toward writing this book. So I march over as a doctoral student to the library, and I'm in the stacks. Again, this is before the internet. This is back, Dr. Carr, when we actually had to go to the library.
How about that? A lost art, unfortunately. We need more. We need to return to those stacks.
We need to return to the library because guess what, students? Everything isn't on Google.
How about
or Bing or any other search engine, but that's another story, right, for another day.
No, it's a lesson. You dropping jewels along the way. So you're in the stacks.
So I'm in the stacks. I think it was Ackerman Library.
Yes.
And I'm gathering these facts about Black academic achievement, the history of Black achievement in the public schools, and just gathering just various and sundry resources.
And I should mention here for those who are listening, a great deal of which you experienced personally. I think about how you talk about your own upbringing and the generations of educators. So this wasn't like you were going in search of something that you knew that you didn't know was there. You knew it was there. You just went to go find it.
Oh, absolutely. I knew it was there because of my own family experience. My father attending the great Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. My mother attending Sumner High School, the great Sumner High School in Kansas City, Kansas. All of their friends whom they met at Meharry and at Howard, who had attended segregated Black schools from Delaware down to Florida over to, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, et cetera. They all had the same story.
Yes.
About the exceptional credentials of their Black teachers and principals. Yes. So I'm in the stacks and literally almost pushed out of the stack, one of the shelves, is the Senate hearings about the displacement of Black principals. And I was shocked by two things. One, that there were Senate hearings, and two, that these occurred in 1971, as late as 1971. So now for our younger listeners, they may say 1971 was ancient history, but don't we think of Brown as 1954? That's right. But really this history still has resonance. It's a history that's not dead and still has resonance today.
It's certainly the history of my generation. I mean, born in 1965, I think about the fact Various and Dara Swan visited Howard's campus, and Lisa Crooms Robinson and myself both said to them, we were the shock troops in Nashville in 1970-71. And when you're writing this book, you're really unveiling. I'm reading every line like, my God, this is what happened to me. I was robbed of those great teachers at Cameron High School and Washington Junior High School, and now I know why. But anyway, so these hearings, what is
you are exactly right in saying that, because it's our generation, Dr. Carr. At best, we might have been the last generation who had these models of intellectual authority and models of leadership authority, models of intellectual authority in teachers and models of leadership authority in the principals. We may, if we were lucky, have been the very last generation of Black students to have experienced these generations of Black teachers who have never been replaced.
I tell my students all the time, we were trained by that last generation, that greatest generation that came out of U.S. apartheid. And you can tell the difference. And I know we're going to talk about that, but this is important to get it in the beginning. So as you're looking through these Senate hearings, what is revealed to you? I mean, what do you see there? I mean, it's amazing we don't know about these hearings.
It is absolutely amazing, because this is the untold part of Jim Crow's Pink Slip, the untold story of Black principal and teacher leadership. And again, this is a message to our young scholars, young PhD students, and newly minted faculty. So these Senate transcripts on the displacement of Black principals have been cited at least 100 times in the literature. And yet the singular story that's shared in the Senate transcripts has not been talked about. The Senate committee was chaired by then Senator Walter Mondale, whom you know later becomes a vice president. And it opens with the testimony of Dr. Betty Smith. Senator Mondale asks Dr. Betty Smith to talk about her experience of being fired after the Brown legal decision. And he explicitly asks her if her experience was unique and singular to her, or if she has evidence that other principals who are Black in Georgia experienced the same thing. He asks her about her academic credentials and the academic credentials of the individual whom replaced her. And this is the focus of the more than 1,500 pages of that transcript and all the supporting documentation, that we lost an exceptionally credentialed generation of Black teachers and principals as a result of massive white resistance to Brown, which was the law of the land. And this massive resistance began prior to Brown, so about 1952, and it extended well into the late 1970s.
We're going to pick up with this on the other side, but as you open the book, so many striking moments as you craft this. And I remember many years ago, well, not that many, but certainly maybe 8 or 9 years ago, when you talked to the freshman class at Howard about your research, reading this and having you characterize this as the largest brain drain in the history of American education and maybe education anywhere. It hit like a thunderclap. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was that many people then?
So we're talking primarily about the 17 dual system states. And these are states which by state law and custom operated racially segregated schools, not just in elementary school, not just in high school, but in college and graduate and professional schools. So what that meant is that Blacks who were residents of those states, who paid tax dollars to support public services in those states, could not attend public schools, colleges and universities, graduate and professional schools. Those state institutions were white reserved. And so we attended HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And if that individual wanted to pursue graduate or professional education, a PhD, a JD, a DDS, an MD, any such degree that was not offered by the HBCU, that Black citizen had to leave the state to earn academic credentials at the graduate level. And so in education, where did most of the individuals who were teachers and principals, after earning their undergraduate credentials at the state's private or public HBCU, where did they go to earn master's and doctoral degrees? In my book, I trace the institutions that they attended. And they attended these institutions in this order: New York University, Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, The Ohio State, University of Michigan, University of Chicago, and Iowa. Those were the top 7 institutions attended by Black educators who were seeking graduate credentials. And they do what I call in the book an academic migration. They go north or Midwest or slightly west, earn their master's and doctoral degrees, and return to the segregated South to teach in all Black segregated schools. As early as 1926, the school that my mother attended for high school, Sumner High School, as early as 1926, 41% of the all Black faculty at my mother's high school had master's and doctoral degrees, and about 3 from University of Chicago and Harvard combined. Now, I'm not just telling that last statistic based on a family anecdote.
Sure.
I found this information through my research and through the Senate hearings. And that was not a fact that was only true of my mother's school. This was broadly true of segregated all Black schools, that despite sometimes dilapidated buildings, despite certain underfunding, despite used books and other curricular materials many times defaced with racial epithets, the teaching force and the leadership force, the teacher and principal workforce was exceptionally credentialed. And they had also experienced learning in a desegregated or integrated environment in their graduate school education. So they returned to the South after, as part of this academic migration, having not only superior academic credentials when compared to their white peers, but also a social experience that their white peers had not had or experienced.
Yes. Can we then take a second here just to pause, and we're going to come back in our second block. And I want you to pick up right there, if you will, with us to talk about their social experiences and this return and how important it is for us to not only take note of what happened, but the implications for what this means for us today in terms of when we start thinking about diversity in education and recruiting Black teachers. We'll be back in a moment with Dean Leslie Fenwick discussing her book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, The Untold Story of Black Principal and Teacher Leadership, here at the Black Table on the Black Star Network.
I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show, Get Wealthy, focuses on the things that your financial advisor and bank isn't telling you, but you absolutely need to know. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We're speaking with Dean Emerita of the Howard University School of Education, Leslie Fenwick, and author of the book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, The Untold Story of Black Principal and Teacher Leadership. Dean, when we left, you were walking us through this remarkable force of educators who returned to the South because they couldn't go to school in their home states. I think about your colleague and our friend, the late Jim Donaldson out of Florida, Lincoln University graduate, 26-year-old PhD from the University of Illinois. So many of them in the Big Ten. I mean, I know I went to Ohio State because Jamie and McDonald Williams had gone to Ohio State in the 40s. And I think about so many who had gone to these schools, and then they came back. And of course, we think of them in terms of HBCUs, in terms of populating those faculties. But you say they were also elementary and junior high school and high school teachers and principals. So how do they stack up against their white counterparts in the apartheid South and the Jim Crow South?
So, as I mentioned, Black teachers across the apartheid South, the 17 dual system states, Black educators, teachers, and principals were more academically credentialed and experienced than their white counterparts. And this was one of the horrors and one of the reasons why this issue reached the ears of Congress in terms of this series of U.S. Senate hearings on the displacement of Black principals. The issue was not simply their displacement. The issue was that they were being fired, demoted, and dismissed and replaced by lesser qualified whites. That was the issue. And that is the focus of the Senate hearings, even though no one has written about this particular focus. So, when we talk about credentials and Black people, qualifications and Black people, I don't want to begin the conversation with our most recent Supreme Court justice. I want to go back to 1952 when superintendents and school boards told qualified Black people, credentialed Black people, superiorly credentialed Black people who, against the racial constriction of the times and nearly half a step out of slavery, worked to get exceptional credentials and be effective teachers, and who were still captured by the arc of racism and purged from our U.S. public school system, much to the detriment of all students, particularly Black students, and much to the detriment of the public school system itself. So to put this in kind of numerical perspective.
Oh, yes, please do. Yes.
For your listening audience.
Yes.
Prior to 1954 in the 17 dual system states, Black educators comprised 35 to 50% of their state's teaching force or principalship force. So the educator workforce was about 35 to 50% Black. Today, out of the nation's 3.2 million teachers, less than 7% are Black. About 11% of the nation's 90,000 principals are Black, and less than 3% of the nation's 13,800 superintendents are Black. And here's something that's quite interesting. Then as now, Black educators are the nation's most academically credentialed educator. Black principals and teachers are more likely to hold a master's and doctoral degree as one indication of quality than their white peers. And yet we're tremendously underrepresented in the ranks of school leadership at the superintendent level, which controls budget and policies for school districts, and at the principalship level that controls the implementation of curriculum and the selection of the teaching force.
Dean, could we take a second there and have you walk us through a couple of things? Number one, the techniques that were used to destroy that pipeline, which admittedly was put together because we were in Jim Crow, but nevertheless produced this high quality group of teachers. You know, you write about people being called incompetent, which is utterly absurd. Principals being taken out of their buildings, and when they're closing the building, if they open the building, they put a less qualified white principal and make them the assistant principal, or they promote them. It looks like a promotion, but you're trying to get rid of them. You talk about these two types of educators, either the people who can go along or the radicals. Let's get them out of the building. But, you know, as you're describing this, so that's one thing. I hope you can walk us through. And also, in terms of how they fought back, you tell the story of a group, all these groups, but the American Teachers Association. It's cost me a lot of money over the years to get the histories of the state level associations that the National Education Association paid for them to write those state histories. But in reading them, I almost get furious because it's like these were real people. These are the heroes of education, these teachers and principals in Arkansas and North Carolina. And you write about, of course, Georgia. Could you talk a little bit about how they got these teachers out of the pipeline and what these teachers did to fight back, to try to hold on, these teachers and principals?
So, you know, while I'm writing the book, I'm thinking that the genius men, and it was all men at the time in terms of the legal strategy, Thurgood Marshall and all of those men. Thurgood Marshall is an NAACP attorney. He later becomes our first African-American Supreme Court justice. I think
our grad, HBCU
grad, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that his record of successfully defending 21 out of 31 cases before the Supreme Court has not been beaten. So no. he's still, you know, HBCU trained.
No question.
And still his record stands in 2022. Okay. So I'm thinking, as I'm reading all of this, all of my research that goes into the book, that Thurgood Marshall and others must know, because they're litigating all the cases in the South that precede Brown and that comprise Brown, that they must know that if Brown is successful, that given the racial customs, strictures, and just base violent racism of these states, that Black educators' jobs would be at risk. And yet I wasn't reading anything in the Senate hearing that said that. And so I call, and this speaks to Howard University and our wonderful resources in Moreland Spingarn. Yes. I call Joellen Bashir, and I hope she hears this on your show, Dr. Carr.
Yes.
And I'm dean at the time, so I'm trying to be dean and conduct this research and not have the two priorities conflict, but they do, because the deanship is consuming.
Well, let me just pause here and put another name in the mix, because you follow in the arc of and are clearly built out of the same stuff as the great Charles Thompson, the editor of the Journal of Negro Education. So, I mean, somehow you make that happen. You're an example of this magic you're writing about.
I wanted to channel him when I became dean. So so I call Ms. Bashir, Joellen Bashir, and I tell her my quandary. I said, I had not had other conversations with her about the book. Mm-hmm. But I tell her my quandary. I said, I think that Thurgood Marshall would know about this, or others would know that this was a prospect, that this might happen, that if Brown is successful, Black educators will lose their job. And she says, well, Dean Fenwick, normally we would invite you to come and review the resources that we have here at Moreland Spingarn and do a little sleuthing on your own to see if you can find the answer to that question. But given your responsibilities as dean, and she was very complimentary of me, I will see what I can find for you. So this was a special favor.
Wow.
And that was the end of that conversation. I would say flash forward 3 weeks later, maybe 4 weeks later, at home, I get a brown envelope addressed to me. I open it, and Joellen Bashir, the Moreland Spingarn archivist and librarian, has copied all of these materials. And one of the things she sent me was a memorandum that Thurgood Marshall had written. He was establishing in the NAACP the Teacher Information and Security Department. And the role of that department was to collect financial resources, because they knew as early as 1952 that if Brown was successful, Black educators were going to lose their jobs, Black teachers and principals, and that they would need financial resources to litigate those cases. And so I credit Joellen Bashir with answering my question and providing me evidence for that. And there were a lot of other interesting memoranda in there signed by Walter White and other leaders of the NAACP at that time, and even before. Thurgood Marshall also documents one of the most egregious cases. Remember now, he and other NAACP attorneys are going south. They're collecting the testimonies of Black principals and teachers about what's happening to them.
Yes.
And in South Georgia, he identifies a principal of a one-room dirt floor schoolhouse. The gentleman had earned his undergraduate credentials as a teacher at Fort Valley State University. At the time, I think Fort Valley College, now today, Fort Valley State University in Southern Georgia, and had gone on to earn a master's degree in educational leadership from Columbia University. Returned to the South and was teaching in a one-room dirt floor, all-Black schoolhouse. And while integration was progressing, or the transfer, I'd prefer to call this the transfer of Black students into previously segregated all-white schools. That's very different than integration. This gentleman was replaced by a white milkman.
Whoa.
Now, this is the most egregious error, the most egregious example. I don't think that example was common, but what is clear by the historical record is that on a near one-to-one basis in the 17 dual system states, exceptionally credentialed and effective Black educators were replaced by less credentialed whites. Some were educators, others were not. And so in many ways, we've gone back. There is no state today that has 35 to 50% of its educator workforce as Black. And the assertion of Jim Crow's pink slip is that we can trace the underrepresentation of Blacks in the educator workforce to this purposeful decimation of the Black educator pipeline, which resulted from white resistance to the Brown decision. And that protracted resistance occurred for more than 25 years.
Thank you, Dean. We're going to take a pause here, and when we come back, let's continue this. You write about the Singleton case. You write, in fact, devote a whole chapter in litigating Jim Crow desegregation. And when we come back, we want to talk about that fight, and not only how the Black educators were involved, but the Black sororities, fraternities, the links, how Black folk fought back. And we'll be back in a moment to continue our conversation with Dean Leslie Fenwick, author of Jim Crow's Pink Slip, here on the Black Star Network. Back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Welcome back to the Black Star Network. This is the Black Table. I'm your host, Greg Carr, joined today by Dean Leslie Fenwick, discussing her book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip. Don't forget to support the Black Star Network. It's not a conversation you're going to see anywhere else, frankly. Dean, when we left, you, of course, in this book, and everyone, you need to get this book because every page is littered with the history of our people. You mentioned Fort Valley. You talk about Horace Mann Bond, of course, who had been the president there and at Lincoln University before that. You talk about these rural educators who were wiped out. And even though that egregious example that you ended last block with may be sort of an outlier, you still talk a lot about how they got these educators out of the school. How you going to call somebody incompetent who has all these degrees and all this experience, and then the legal challenges, which you write about in the chapter Litigating Jim Crow Desegregation? You know, these legal challenges, there were some successes, weren't there, in terms of trying to attack this because it's so baldly racist. Could you talk a little bit about how they fought back and how they recruited Black folk in the community to help and how the Black professional class helped as well?
Your language about baldly false is very important here. So yes, chapter 4, litigating Jim Crow, summarizes and analyzes all the legal cases that ensued, given the firing, dismissal, and demotion of these 100,000 Black teachers and principals. And the fight was primarily led, the Herculean effort, by the NAACP. So Black teachers and principals are bringing their case to the NAACP. And remember now, the NAACP isn't located away from what's happening. The lawyers, primarily African-American, Jewish, some white, are going into these states and they're living in these states and they're recording what's happening to Black teachers and principals. So they're not removed from the reality, the hot reality of everyday life with Black people. Absolutely. They're part of this reality.
Absolutely. Let's stop. And I want to mention that we interviewed Margaret Edds, who wrote a book on Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill. Of course, Virginia Union trained, Howard University trained lawyers, and the school pay equalization fights that they had predating Brown. So the point you're raising now, I mean, is very important in this era when we think of Black leadership as not necessarily emerging out of Black communities. These Black folk and folks like Jack Greenberg, as you say, they are literally living with the communities they're fighting with. That's critical. It's
critical. The other piece that's critical that doesn't get talked about as much is that, Black teachers, many of whom were female, are responsible for universal education public education becoming a reality in the South. And this is really well chronicled by James D. Anderson's book, which I think should be read by every person, every American. Certainly every African American person needs to read his book, The Education of Blacks in the South, because it will remove any miseducation about the vigorous pursuit of education by Black people and where that pursuit originated. It did not originate on this continent. Africans brought a deep and abiding commitment to a certain type of education and socialization of children and young people.
And let me just pause here to inject in terms of what you write about. You talk about what this basically demotion and elimination of so many educators and principals of African descent does to the curriculum. It was very powerful when you wrote about that, and you talk about particularly these Black women who are not only modeling for their young people, but infusing them not only with a curriculum that in many ways is superior to the white schools in terms of the classical Eurocentric curriculum, Latin and Greek, but equally, if not more importantly, the cultural values that they represent. And I love the phrase that you use, cultural elision. When you talk about that cultural elision, I mean, you know, this isn't just about jobs, although you also write about what this does to Black wealth in this country. I'm like, how is Jim Crow's Pink Slip not the first book we look at when we start talking about education, but the cultural grounding? I mean, you know, this smashing this pipeline it's beyond the demographic. And you write about that. You say it's bigger than the data, although the data hasn't been brought forward. There's this cultural elision. Can you take a minute and talk about what are the implications of this for even today?
So, and I've talked about the teachers and a large percentage of them being female, and this is related to your question. And the majority of principals at the time are African-American males in the all Black segregated schools. And in all white segregated schools, the majority of principals at the time are also male. You know, it wasn't until about the late 1980s that females as a group, regardless of race, become the majority of principals. Okay. So students are losing out on these models, as I said earlier, of Black intellectual authority and Black leadership authority when they're pushed into the previously segregated all white schools. You asked me so many questions there.
Oh, just anywhere, because everybody has to get this book, quite frankly. And I know we're going to be teaching it. So I'm just glad this is our point of entry for so many people. But go ahead. Anywhere you want to pick, of course. Then.
Well, let me talk about chapter 4, the legal cases, which it took quite some time to compile those and analyze them. There were several important partners, and one of the things I was saying is that all of this is under the Herculean leadership of the NAACP and its attorneys, but there were partners, important partners across, I would say, a cross-racial alliance led by the NAACP, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, which had previously primarily been an all-white and male organization, comes to the aid at the urging of Black principals and teachers to say, yes, this is a national problem. And they pressure the Nixon administration. They write amicus briefs. They testify in these series of Senate hearings saying, this is an atrocity and it must stop. The American Friends Service Committee, which we know as a Quaker human rights organization, goes into the South. They do some very powerful studies about how Black students who've been pushed into previously all-white segregated schools, how they're being treated in these schools. Teachers tearing up their homework, teachers requiring that they sit in the back rows, teachers requiring that students, Black students, turn their desks to the back wall, ignoring physical abuse. The American Friends Service Committee a Quaker organization committed to human rights, goes into the South and records this and has powerful studies, not only about the bloodletting, the purging of Black educators, but how students are being treated. The American Jewish Congress also lending legal support, amicus briefs, commentary and strategy to fight this horror. So one of the messages of Chapter 4 is that Black educators come to their own defense and utilize the NAACP to fight the cause. And they also, these Black educators, urge and encourage other conscious organizations cross-racially to join the fight for right. Unfortunately, most of the damage is done even as the legal process unfolds. Individuals have lost their jobs. And kind of the last thing I'll say in this next few seconds is that the economic impact to the Black community, 100,000 educators fired, dismissed, and demoted, becomes about $1 billion in terms of the cumulative financial impact. That would be about $2.2 billion in today's money.
My goodness. That is, I mean, it's stunning. It's stunning to hear and to certainly see assembled. So let's pick up with this then our last segment when we come back from our break with your recommendations, because you certainly end the book with a forceful set of 9 recommendations on what can be done. What can be done in this situation when we face this huge brain drain and the implications that it's had right through today. So when we come back with Dean Fenwick, we will end our discussion for now, pause it, of Jim Crow's Pink Slip here on the Black Star Network at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
When you talk about Blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it.
This is about covering us.
Invest in Black-owned media.
Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks.
We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible.
Checks and money orders go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Don't forget to support the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dean Emerita of Howard University School of Education, Leslie Fenwick. Dean, every page I was thinking, I remember those days when the Black students, I was one of those Black students who, you know, the discipline stuff, all the things. And you talk about the fact that integration for this system in the South and beyond, but really in the South, meant they wanted the students to integrate, but they didn't want those teachers, those Black teachers, to have control. And so they got rid of the teachers, you know, but you end with 9 recommendations because this is the world we live in now. And you paint this picture and you show us that this was not accidental. This was very deliberate. But of course, and I love the last thing you write in the epilogue when you write, now this quote you to yourself, you don't mind, what would it mean for American democracy when these young people, many of whom have been pushed and held at the margins of social, political, and economic order, are the majority? And you talk about non-white students being the majority now in the public schools. Will their commitment to democracy and public schooling be resonant, or will it be absent? How do we fix this, Dean? it's got to be fixed. We're here, right? So I mean,
we have to fix it. You see me glancing down, and I can only imagine how students in your class feel, because I have to take notes on your question.
No, you had to take notes. you live this.
we could have a 5-hour conversation. I'm trying to focus my.
Take your time. You want to come back? We have to invite you back.
I will say this. In the policy world, research. As I teach my students in policy class, research informs policy. Policy is to inform funding. So, research, policy, program, intervention, funding. There's this circle. And so one of the things I was attempting to do in the book is eradicate this myth that's often said in poetry voices. I say it in poetry voices. Black students pursued careers previously unopened to them after Brown. And that's why we have less than 7% of our nation's 3.2 million teachers as members of African American or Black racial groups or ethnic groups. That is not factual, but you will hear that and read that in the research literature, in social commentary about the underrepresentation of Blacks in the educator workforce. It's constantly repeated, and yet the historical record does not show that desegregation ushered in the release of Blacks from the educator professions voluntarily. What the historical record shows is that Blacks were purged from teaching and leadership positions in the public school systems across the United States. And we have not yet recovered from that purging. That's the first thing. The second part of the myth is that Brown really meant the integration of Black students into previously segregated all-white schools. Brown never said, close all the Black schools, fire the Black principals, teachers, and principals, and push Black students into previously all-white segregated spaces. But that's what was orchestrated to occur in order to maintain the segregationist hold on the public school system and the monies that supported it. And so there's a myth busting that is an intention of Jim Crow's pink slip here. A correcting of the record about what Brown meant and what we still haven't fulfilled. Brown meant that we were to cease segregation in public schools. And ceasing segregation meant to wholly integrate the student bodies, the faculties, and the staff, meaning administrative staff. So in order to achieve Brown, what we were to have done was to integrate teachers, the teaching body, the principalship, and the student bodies. And yet on June 15th, 1971, the nation turns its attention away from the conversation and the fight to integrate the educator workforce, teachers and principals, into desegregating schools, and defines desegregation as the simple presence of Black students in previously all-white schools. So we focus now on these ratios of Black to white students rather than the larger good which would have been served. And I asked the question in the book, where would we be today if these generations of exceptionally credentialed Black educators who at the time had a commitment to anti-Black racism, and how do you know they had a commitment to anti-Black racism? They were establishing NAACP chapters, and they were leading voting rights campaigns in very threatening circumstances. Okay. Very racially constricted settings, many times with threats against their own lives. And so in order for us to kind of correct this circumstance, we need to know the myth, understand the actual history, and then write policy that addresses the historical record.
Yes.
And that's what led me to the 9 recommendations that conclude Jim Crow's Pink Slip.
Thank you, Dean. I think we probably need to have a 2-hour segment of the Black Table to even begin to sketch the full range of Jim Crow's Pink Slip. But somehow, in the space of 50 minutes, you were able to give us the broad scope and do some drill downs in terms of some specific examples. This is a truly remarkable book. And as we've been saying since you first shared it with our 18 and 19-year-olds at Howard, your research, we've been waiting, and everyone needs to get Jim Crow's Pink Slip, particularly as it empties into some policy recommendations that can truly perhaps fulfill the promise of this experiment we got drug into against our will, but nevertheless, we're here now, so we better do something about it. So, Dean Fenwick, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you with us.
Dr. Carr, it's a real honor to see you and to be on the Black Table, and I really commend the network for providing scholars and others this kind of outlet for our community and other conscious communities. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll be back in a moment. We're going to clear the table and get ready for next week's segment at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we've seen shooting.
We're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We've been joined for the last hour by Professor Leslie Fenwick, Dean Emerita of the Howard University School of Education, a finalist for the Secretary of Education job in the Biden administration. In fact, she should have gotten that job. She would never say that, but I'm telling y'all right now. And some of you didn't know Dean Fenwick before, you know now why that would have been a good move. So many other things. She is an institution builder. She certainly, as a co-founder of the Urban Superintendents Academy, and under her leadership as Dean of Howard School of Education, working hard to rebuild that pipeline of Black educators. So we're going to close today with a reminder from the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who Dr. Fenwick writes about, when he addressed Black educators at Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1960, in a speech he gave entitled Whither Now and Why. You've heard me talk about that before. And he said, you know, segregation is going to end. These laws are going to change. And when they do, we're going to be faced with the deeper issues of race, culture. And if we don't address these issues of race and culture as it relates to education, our children are going to be pulled into a system where they will be defenseless. And as we heard Dean Fenwick say, this was something that the NAACP anticipated and yet found itself powerless to prevent in the face of structured opposition, not just from the South, but in some cases from the federal government, from the testing agencies like ETS and others. And so we are faced now with a challenge. Will we educate our young people in this country, or will we surrender to the forces who simply want to choose something else over our common humanity? We know the answer to that is up to us, and we will meet the challenge. Join us next week at the Black Table. We will continue, and don't forget to support the Black Star Network. Thank you.